This hearing will come to order. This morning we consider al-Qaeda's resurgence in Iraq. An unfortunate reality is that al-Qaeda in Iraq, now known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS as you see it in the papers, is growing steadily in size, it's growing steadily in power and influence, and its militant ranks have blossomed. Last summer, ISIS carried out attacks on 2 different prisons in Iraq, and in those attacks freed hundreds of experienced al-Qaeda fighters and leaders. The group is now able to carry out approximately 40 mass casualty attacks every month. Multiple car bombings struck the capital this morning. The nearly 9,000 deaths in Iraq last year made it the bloodiest since U.S. forces departed in 2011. The civil war in neighboring Syria only further strengthens this group. Militants are able to flow freely between Iraq and Syria, providing ISIS an advantage as it works to advance its regional vision of a radical Islamist state. Their gains have been dramatic. Last month, these fighters took advantage of a security vacuum in Anbar province, entering the cities of Fallujah and Ramadi in columns of trucks mounted with heavy machine guns and raising the black flag over government buildings. Of course, Anbar province is where U.S. Marines fought so hard to push out al-Qaeda. In recognizing those and other great sacrifices, I should note that this committee benefits from the first-hand experiences of Mr. Kinzinger, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Perry, Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Collins, and Ms. Gabbard, all of whom served with distinction in Iraq. This threat is evolving. Earlier this week, al-Qaeda's central leadership declared that those operating in western Iraq and Syria were no longer an affiliated group. We will see how this power struggle develops, but ISIS's independence is a reflection of its unprecedented resources, including weapons and personnel and cash, and its resulting operational strength. This is a threat to Iraq, but also to us. ISIS has reportedly been actively recruiting individuals capable of traveling to the U.S. to carry out attacks here. While al-Qaeda in Iraq has been powered by prison breaks and by the Syrian civil war, it has also been fueled by the alienation of much of the Sunni population from the Shias-dominated government in Baghdad. Al-Qaeda has become very skilled at exploiting this sectarian rift, and Maliki's power grab has given them much ammunition. This is a point that Ranking Member Eliot Engel and myself raised and underscored with President Maliki when he visited Washington last fall. This committee will play a central role as the United States moves to send military equipment to help the Iraqis fight these terrorists. Appropriate intelligence can be shared as well, but Iraqis should know that their relations with Iran and the slow pace of political reconciliation with minority groups raise serious congressional concerns. While we may not be, as head of state, while he may not be up to it, Maliki must take steps to lead Iraq to a post-sectarian era. The Iraqi government is far from perfect, and only the Iraqis can control their future. But if we don't want to see an Iraq with large swaths of territory under militant control, and we should not, then we must be willing to lend an appropriate hand. And I'll now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Engel, for any opening comments. Mr. Engel from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing on al-Qaeda's resurgence in Iraq and the threat this poses to U.S. security interests. I appreciate the close collaboration that we have working on this and so many other issues on this committee. Last month, al-Qaeda extremists occupied the city of Fallujah and parts of Ramadi in Iraq's Sunni-dominated Anbar province. To be sure, this has serious implications for Iraq's security, but it also has a deeper symbolic meaning for Americans. As all of us know, U.S. Marines fought 2 bloody battles to secure Fallujah during the Iraq War. I want to acknowledge our brave men and women in uniform who lost their lives, as well as their families who continue to grieve their losses every day. It breaks my heart when I see what's happening in Iraq today. Iraq continues to be ravaged by sectarian violence, and the situation is getting worse. Last year, more than 8,500 Iraqis were killed in bombings, shootings, and other violent acts, the most since 2008. I should note that on Monday of this week, the senior leadership of al-Qaeda excommunicated and disowned their affiliate, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, as a result of that group's tactics in Syria. For the purpose of this hearing, ISIS remains a threat to stability in Fallujah, other areas of Anbar province, and the whole of Iraq. Some may argue that the lack of an enduring U.S. troop presence in Iraq has contributed to the resurgence of violence, especially Sunni terrorism related to al-Qaeda. But let's be honest, the dire security situation in Anbar province is much more about Iraqi politics than it is about the United States. In any case, the direct use of U.S. military force in Iraq is virtually unthinkable at this point. We've withdrawn from Iraq and we aren't going back. Although we no longer have boots in the ground, however, the U.S. does maintain a huge stake in Iraq's security, and I believe we should continue to provide appropriate assistance to the Iraqi military in their fight against ISIS. But we must also recognize that the current situation in Anbar cannot be resolved through military means alone. An all-out assault on Fallujah by the Iraqi security forces would play right into the hands of ISIS, reinforcing the perception among Sunnis that they have been systematically victimized by Prime Minister Malaki's Shia-led government. To defeat al-Qaeda, the Iraqi government must take a page out of our playbook from the Iraq War and enlist moderate Sunni tribes in the fight. I understand that Vice President Biden recently discussed this issue with Prime Minister Maliki, encouraging him to incorporate tribal militias fighting ISIS into Iraqi security forces and to compensate those injured and killed in battle. By taking these steps, I am hopeful that Maliki can begin to bridge the widening sectarian gulf in Iraq. The deterioration of Iraq's control over Anbar is also linked to larger regional dynamics. We saw how al-Qaeda in Iraq expanded its franchise into Syria, and we now see violence from that brutal war spilling back into Iraq. This has strengthened ISIS and served as a recruitment vehicle for thousands of foreign fighters. The slow bleed in Syria has been a clear hindrance to progress in Iraq. Iran's nefarious influence in the region also contributes to instability. It is well known that some senior Iraqi officials have a very cozy relationship with Iran, and Iraq has not done nearly enough to prevent Iranian overflights that deliver weapons to Hezbollah and the Assad regime in Syria. In order to stabilize Iraq, the Iraqi government will need to be a more responsible actor in the region. Chairman Royce and I emphasized that point when we met with Mr. Maliki several months ago. The discussion today is important to understand how we can encourage a political solution in Iraq that will give Sunnis a meaningful stake in the future of their country. This is the only viable way to build a safer future for Iraq while helping to curb Iranian influence and hopefully reducing the violence in Syria. I'd like to thank Deputy Assistant Secretary Brett McGurk, one of the foremost experts on Iraq, for being here today to address these issues with us. Mr. McGurk, I look forward to your testimony and our discussion. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We'll hear for a minute from Eliana Ross-Leitonen, Chair of the Middle East Subcommittee, followed by Mr. Ted Deutsch, who is the ranking member of that subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And in addition to the biggest issue, which is that we don't have al-Qaeda on the run, there are two issues which I continue to be very concerned about. First is the safety of the residents of Camp Liberty. They still have very little protection. When last you testified, Mr. McGurk, 192 T-walls were up. Then the big progress, supposedly, is that 43 T-walls are now up in addition. This is out of 17,500 T-walls. T-walls save lives. Put them up. Number two, the Iraqi Jewish Archives. Ted Deutsch and I and many other members are very concerned, don't want them to be shipped back. The Iraqi government incorrectly states that these papers are theirs. That is not true, and we hope that you continue to work on that. And the bigger issue that brings us together is that obviously since the departure of our troops, al-Qaeda's reemergence has caused Iraq to take a very worrisome turn for the worse. We've sacrificed so much blood and treasure there to watch it descend into a full sectarian violence and al-Qaeda safe haven. So we've got to safe haven. We've got to rebuild our influence there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Ross-Layton. We'll go to Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Engel for holding this extremely timely hearing. Emboldened by instability within Iraq's government and the Syrian conflict, al-Qaeda affiliated, the number of al-Qaeda affiliated fighters in Iraq has now reached levels not seen since 2006. Al-Qaeda in Iraq's offshoot, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is now the primary perpetrator of the worst violence. And as my colleagues have noted, al-Qaeda has now disavowed the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria for its use of tactics deemed to be too violent. Let me say that again. Al-Qaeda, one of the world's worst and most brutal terrorist groups, has disowned this group for being too extreme. I fear the siege of Anbar and Fallujah in January has definitively turned the page from simply labeling this spillover from the Syrian conflict to a full-scale resurgence of terror in Iraq. Various reports count the number of killed in January at close to 1,000. I'm particularly concerned for the 140,000 who fled their homes as rockets were indiscriminately fired and need humanitarian aid. The security risks posed by this resurgence are too great to ignore, and Deputy Assistant Secretary McGurk, I hope today you'll be able to shed light on what level of assistance we're providing the Iraqis and our comprehensive strategy to prevent the growth of this security threat. And I look forward to that testimony, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Now, lastly, we'll go to Judge Ted Poe of Texas, Chairman of the Terrorism Subcommittee, followed by Brad Sherman for a minute of California, who's the ranking member of that subcommittee.
Al-Qaeda in Iraq is back, certainly not on its last legs. The United States has paid a high price to help liberate Iraq from the menace of Al-Qaeda. It is frustrating that Al-Qaeda is gaining ground back in Iraq. Al-Qaeda's resurgence is directly related to Prime Minister Maliki's mishandling of his government. Incompetence and corruption seem to be the norm. He centralized power, alienated the Sunnis, and brought back Shia hit squads. He has allowed Iranian-supported operatives to kill MEK Iranian dissidents, now on 7 occasions without consequences. The last time you were here, Mr. McGurk, you testified before my subcommittee and Eliana Ross-Layton's subcommittee. I predicted that there would be another attack. 7 days after you testified in December, Camp Liberty was attacked again. All this chaos has created an environment ripe for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is reestablishing a safe haven to plan and launch attacks outside the region. That is totally unacceptable trend. The question is, what is the United States going to do? And I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
In the 1940s, we occupied countries. No one doubted our right to occupy. We took our time. We created new governments, and those governments created new societies. At various other times, we've invaded countries, achieved a limited military objective, or as much of as could be achieved at reasonable cost, and we left. The first example of that was Thomas Jefferson's military intervention in Libya. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we established a bad example. The world and even some in the United States doubted our right to occupy, so we hastily installed Karzai in Afghanistan, and in Iraq we installed a structure which is now presided over by Mr. Maliki. It is not surprising that Afghanistan and Iraq continue to be problems since we hastily handed over governance to those who are ill-prepared. Iraq is not the most important Arab state strategically. It does not become more important in the future because we made a mistake in the past that cost us dearly in blood and treasure. We should not compound that mistake. On the other hand, Iraq is important in part because of its proximity to Iran, which I believe is one of the greatest threats to our national security. Finally, I agree with several of the prior speakers that we need to, with regard to Camp Liberty and the T-walls, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq and Iran, Mr. Brett McGurk. Prior to this current assignment, Mr. McGurk served as a special advisor to the National Security Staff and as senior advisor to Ambassadors Ryan Crocker, Chris Hill, and James Jeffrey in Baghdad. He also served as a lead negotiator and coordinator during bilateral talks with the Iraqi government back in 2008. Without objection, by the way, your full prepared statement will be made part of the record, and the members here will have 5 days to submit any statements or questions or any other extraneous material for the record. And Mr. McGurk, if you would please summarize your remarks, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the situation in Iraq with a focus on al-Qaeda's primary offshoot in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. My brief statement will discuss the threat from ISIL, the current situation in Ramadi and Fallujah, and how we intend to help the Iraqis combat it. ISIL is well known to us. Its former incarnation, al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, was the focus of U.S. and Iraqi security efforts over many years, beginning with the rise of its first leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, more than a decade ago. Its current leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is a designated global terrorist under U.S. law and, we believe, is currently based in Syria. His mission, as clearly stated in his own statements, is to carve out a zone of governing territory from Baghdad through Syria to Lebanon. The Syria conflict over the past 2 years provided a platform for ISIL to gain resources, recruits, and safe havens. While the precise number of ISIL fighters in Syria is unknown, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper last week testified that there are likely 26,000 extremist fighters in Syria, including 7,000 foreign fighters. Many of these fighters are affiliated with ISIL. ISIL, in its earlier incarnation, AQI, inflicted mass casualties attacks in Iraq over the years 2011 and 2012. But it was not until early last year that we began to see a significant increase in its attacks, most notably suicide and vehicle bombs. Suicide attacks, we assess, are nearly all attributable to ISIL, and nearly all suicide bombers are foreign fighters who enter Iraq through Syria. To give one notable statistic, in November 2012, Iraq saw 3 suicide attacks throughout the country. In November 2013, it saw 50. ISIL is now striking in Iraq along 3 main lines of operations. First, it is attacking Shia civilian areas in an effort to rekindle a civil war. These are the vast majority of attacks. Second, it is attacking Sunni areas to eliminate rivals and govern territory. In one 30-day period between September and October, for example, ISIL suicide bombers attacked 3 small towns in Anbar province. Third, ISIL is now attacking the Kurds in northern Iraq and disputed boundary areas to incite ethnic tension and unrest. ISIL likely staged and planned many of these attacks at remote encampments in western Iraq. The Iraqis began to spot these camps late last summer, but proved unable to target them effectively due to unarmored helicopters and the lack of other necessary CT equipment, which is needed to deny terrorists safe haven. Today, thanks to close cooperation from this committee and the Congress, we've begun to address this problem, as I will discuss in more detail. By the end of last year, signature ISIL attacks, vehicle and suicide bombs matched levels not seen since the summer of 2007. Overall, violence remains far lower, mainly because Shia militias have yet to respond en masse to ISIL provocations. But the risks of such reprisals rise as ISIL attacks rise. Also, over the course of 2013, political instability and continuous unrest in Sunni areas enabled but did not cause ISIL's rise. There was a protest movement that began after a number of bodyguards to former Minister of Finance Rafi Asawi were detained by Iraqi security forces. These protests placed on the national agenda a number of legitimate demands, such as ending the process of de-Baathification and ensuring criminal due process. We supported these legitimate demands, and we worked with all parties to shape a package of legislation to address them, which is now pending in the Iraqi parliament. Ongoing violence, however, has made it difficult for Shia and Kurdish blocs to support this package of legislation, absent concessions for their own constituencies. Over the course of the spring and into the summer, the protest movement became more militant, with al-Qaeda flags spotted in protest squares. This accelerated a vicious cycle. ISIL exploited unaddressed grievances and increasing violence put long overdue reforms further out of reach. This brings us to where we are today and how we intend to help the Iraqis fight back. On January 1st, 2014, convoys of up to 100 trucks with mounted heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft guns flying the black flag of al-Qaeda entered the central cities of Fallujah and Ramadi. They deployed to key objectives, destroyed most police stations, and secured vital crossways. The police in both cities nearly disintegrated. The domination of these central cities was a culmination of ISIL's 2013 strategy to govern territory and establish 7th century Islamic rule. In Fallujah, days after seizing central areas, ISIL declared the city part of an Islamic caliphate. This message, however, is not popular in Anbar province. In Ramadi, in the hours after ISIL arrived in force, tribal leaders organized and asked for funds and arms from the central government to retake their streets. The government responded with money, weapons, and assurances that tribal fighters would enjoy full benefits of any soldier in the Iraqi army. I have been to Iraq twice since the new year. In meetings with Prime Minister Maliki and other Iraqi leaders, I have pressed upon them the urgent necessity of mobilizing the population against ISIL. I have also discussed the situation directly with tribal and local leaders in Anbar province. These coordinated efforts have begun to produce results. Fighting continues in Ramadi's outskirts, but local leaders report that the central city is increasingly secure, with tribal fighters working in coordination with local leaders. The Iraqi army has remained outside, helping where necessary to secure populated areas. The situation in Fallujah is more serious, with hardened ISIL fighters and former insurgents in control of the streets. 1 week ago, ISIL fighters captured a group of Iraqi soldiers, paraded them around the city, flying al-Qaeda's black flag, and then executed them. Further complicating the situation, we assess that some tribes in and around Fallujah are supporting ISIL, while others are fighting ISIL, and many others remain on the fence. The hardened fighters inside the city are seeking to draw the army into a direct confrontation. Thus far, the army has not taken the bait, focusing its efforts on the outskirts and keeping tribal fighters in the lead. But make no mistake, the government of Iraq, working in full coordination with local leaders and the local population, has a responsibility to secure Fallujah. Under the plan that is now being developed, as explained to us by local and national leaders late last week, tribal fighters will lead this effort with the Army in support when needed. The United States is prepared to offer advice, make recommendations, and share lessons learned based on our deep experience in these areas. General Austin, in a visit to Baghdad last week, had a series of candid conversations with Iraqi officials and commanders about the importance of patience and planning. ISIL is also planning to consolidate control of Fallujah and move 30 miles east to Baghdad. In a rare audio statement on January 21st, ISIL's leader directed his fighters, quote, to be on the front lines against the Shia and march towards Baghdad. Were there any doubt of potential risks for the United States, he added what he said was a direct message to the Americans, quote, soon we will be in direct confrontation, so watch for us, for we are with you, watching, end quote. We take such threats seriously, and through cooperation with this committee and the Congress, we intend to help the Iraqis in their efforts to defeat ISIL over the long term. Here's how. First, we are pressing the national leadership from the highest possible levels to develop a holistic security, political, economic strategy to isolate extremists from the population. This means supporting local tribal fighters, incorporating those fighters into the security services, and committing to April elections to be held on time. Second, we are supporting the Iraqi security forces through accelerated foreign military sales, training, and information sharing. The Iraqis have now equipped Caravan aircraft, for example, to fire Hellfire missiles, thereby denying ISIL safe haven in the western desert. Such assistance is offered pursuant to a holistic strategy, and we have made clear to the Iraqis that security operations, while a necessary condition for defeating ISIL, are not sufficient. Third, we are actively encouraging an aggressive economic component to mobilize the Sunni population against ISIL. In the 5 weeks since ISIL entered Ramadi and Fallujah, the GOI has allocated over $35 million to Anbar province in assistance and payments to fighters. Throughout, our message to all Iraqi leaders is firm. Despite your differences across a host of issues, you must find a way to work together when it comes to ISIL, an organization that threatens all Iraqis. This is particularly true for Prime Minister Maliki, who, as the head of state, must take extra measures to reach out to Sunni leaders and draw a critical mass of the local population into the fight. I want to thank you again for allowing me to address this most important topic. Look forward to working closely with you in the months ahead to protect U.S. interests in Iraq and throughout the region, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGurk. The first question I was going to ask you related to something that happened last summer. There were militant camps and training grounds spotted in western Iraq, so we could see this brewing. And yesterday, we heard the CIA director note before Congress that there are camps inside of both Iraq and Syria that are, in his words, used by al-Qaeda to develop capabilities that are applicable both in theater as well as beyond. So you noted that the Iraqi government could spot these camps, but did not have the ability to target effectively, leaving safe havens just miles from populated areas, in your words. If these al-Qaeda camps present a direct threat to our interests and the Iraqis can't deal with it, then why weren't we doing more against these camps? You know, how would this gap that the Iraqi capabilities obviously can't meet be closed? How could you effectively move on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me kind of walk through the last 4 or 5 months. Really, late last summer, the Iraqis spotted some of these camps, and they tried to target them. They flew Bell 104 helicopters out, 407 helicopters out there. The helicopters were shot up by PKC machine guns. They tried to send the Army out there. The Army was IED'd on the roads, which were heavily booby-trapped. So it was pretty clear that despite a very strong Iraqi security force capability, they were not able to target camps in these remote areas, and their special forces also could not operate effectively in those areas. And that is when we began to accelerate some of our foreign military assistance programs and also information sharing to get a better intelligence picture. So 2 notable developments over recent months. First, the Iraqis have begun very effective with the Hellfire missile strikes through their Caravan aircrafts, and we are helping them in the find, fix, and finish mission in which they're undertaking. And second, we believe, as we've had many discussions with this committee, many good discussions, that Apache helicopter platforms are really a critical platform for denying safe haven in these areas over the long term. And I want to thank this committee for helping us with that sale, which was recently approved. But this won't be immediate. It won't be until later this year that the first leased helicopters get into the country and are operational. But that is really a long-term solution to this problem.
The other question I was going to ask you was, in your testimony, you called suicide bombers a key data point we track and noted that these suicide bombers operating in Iraq are, in fact, foreign fighters that have come in. Where are these foreign fighters coming from? We've seen reports that close to 1,000 have come from Europe, some from the U.S. I was going to ask you, how do you assess the threat to U.S. personnel, not only that threat to personnel and our interests in the region, but also here in the United States?
Mr. Chairman, the foreign fighters in Syria are coming from all over the world. This is a problem we faced in the years 2006 to 2008 when foreign fighters were coming into Syria and also making their way into Iraq through what was then the al-Qaeda in Iraq network. They're coming mainly from the region. But we do assess from our best intelligence assessments that the suicide bombers are foreign fighters. Right now, they do not pose a direct threat to us or our personnel, but they pose a direct threat to the stability of Iraq. The suicide bombers, and again, about 5 to 10 a month over 2011 and 2012, now about 30 to 40 a month, it has a pernicious effect on the political discourse in the country. Car bombs, the Iraqis have been able to protect against car bombs. You don't see mass casualty car bomb attacks like you used to see. There's still a lot of car bombs, but casualties are lower. It's the suicide bombers that are able to get into funerals, mosques, populated areas and cause mass casualties, which has just a devastating effect on the country. So it's a very serious problem and a regional problem.
And the last question I'll ask in my remaining moments, you were just in Baghdad meeting with Iraqi officials, and you state that you detected for the first time acknowledgement that government of Iraq missteps may have made the problem worse. And as I noted in my statement, this is not the feeling that Ranking Member Engel and I received when we raised this issue with the President of Iraq in our meeting. So that was a few months ago. I am somewhat encouraged by this, but how encouraged should we be? Because our concern has long been that this lack of reconciliation is compounding the problem seriously.
I have found, frankly, Mr. Chairman, an attitude among the Iraqis that was similar to the tactics that we used in the early part of the war, that the security problem was simply a security problem and not a problem that was fused with politics and economics. And we had a series of conversations over the course of last year as the ISIL attacks increased, in which Iraqis saw this mainly as a security problem. All I can say is that I've been there twice this month since the entry of ISIL into Fallujah and Ramadi, and I have heard from across the board, from the Prime Minister on down, that unless you enlist local Sunnis in those areas, you will never defeat and isolate ISIL. And we have seen that now manifested in a commitment. The Iraqi cabinet has passed a number of resolutions saying tribal fighters will be given full benefits of the state. And most significantly, Prime Minister Maliki has made a commitment that tribal fighters who oust ISIL from these areas will be incorporated into the formal security services of the state, the police and the army. That did not happen with the awakening fighters that we worked with in 2006 to 2008. So that is a very significant commitment. We now need to stay on the Iraqis to make sure they follow through.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCook, let me ask you about al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's been reported that al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, has disowned the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So if that's true, what does that mean for al-Qaeda's presence in Iraq? What are the repercussions for ISIS operating without the al-Qaeda umbrella? And how will this affect the rebel infighting in Syria now that al-Nusra has the blessing of al-Qaeda?
Well, both ISIL and al-Nusra were both came out of al-Qaeda in Iraq. ISIL basically is al-Qaeda in Iraq. Its leader was the al-Qaeda in Iraq leader since 2010. Nusra was a bit of an offshoot and is focused more on Syria. As you said, there is now this message, which seems from Zawahiri, saying that ISIL is no longer affiliated with al-Qaeda Central. I would defer to my intelligence colleagues on the long-term effects, but what we have found is that ISIL has such a media presence, such a propaganda presence, and is able to self-sustain itself by controlling facilities in eastern Syria, including oil facilities, and also through extortion rackets in cities in western Iraq, that it will be able to maintain its cycle of operations. In terms of those who are recruited and come into ISIL, it's really their message, and it goes all the way back to Zarqawi 10 years ago, is just very perniciously sectarian, that Shia Muslims in particular simply don't have a right to live and they should be killed. And those who believe that tend to gravitate towards ISIL. Nusra is more of a al-Qaeda Central-like message, and it also including a threat to us. But I think despite this new statement we've seen, I think ISIL is going to maintain its pace of operations and continue to be a very serious threat.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions about Iraq and Iran and the relationship. When I look back at the war in Iraq, what really breaks my heart is that we lost so many Americans, so much American blood, and now it's almost as if we didn't do anything. Nothing we did was positive. It's all been eroded, and it really just breaks my heart for people who lost loved ones there. We're the ones responsible, in my opinion, for making Iran the hegemonic power in the region, because Iran and Iraq for years fought wars, checked each other, and once we blew up, not that Saddam Hussein was worth anything, but once we blew up the minority Sunni regime in Iraq, and it seems to me it was only obvious that the Shias in Iraq would gravitate to the Shias in Iran. And the sad thing is that Iran has more influence, in my opinion, in Iraq now than we have. So there are reports, and Chairman Royce and I raised this with Mr. Maliki when he was in Washington, that Iraq's allowing Iran overflights as Iran seeks to arm Hezbollah Hezbollah obviously is now fighting the war in Syria on Assad's side. It's helping Hezbollah expand its presence in Syria, defending the Assad regime. So can you characterize that relationship that Prime Minister Maliki and other senior Iraqi officials have with Iran? And how would you describe Iraq's commitments to the U.S. on the overflight issue? Does Maliki understand how this destabilizes the region?
Iraq's relationship with Iran is multifaceted. We have found repeatedly over the years that Iraq acts primarily in its own interests. We've found very few instances in which we've seen Iraq acting at the behest of Iran, in which it did not see it acting in its own interests. You can look at that in terms of Iraq's overall oil production. You can look at it in terms of Iraq ratifying the additional protocol. You can look at it in terms of Iraq supporting the Geneva I communique, a number of steps in which we know the Iranians were pressing the Iraqis not to do things, and the Iraqis did them. The issue of overflights is something where the Iraqis have not done enough. We have seen the number of flights come down. We continue to press this issue. Inspections go up, inspections go down. It's very frustrating. It's often very difficult for us to get a precise intelligence picture of specific flights and what's on a flight. We know that material, we believe, is coming on civilian aircraft. So it's a problem that we focus on all the time. It's the one area where I can say Iraq is simply not doing enough.
Thank you. I just want to make one final comment, and that is, it was my opinion when the chairman and I met with Mr. Maliki that he was a good listener, but I didn't think he provided too much in terms of answers to the questions we had, one of which was overflights. I think that he just came to listen, but really didn't come to put his head together with us and help solve the problem.
I found, Congressman, that since the Prime Minister's trip, that your meeting with him, other meetings he had here on the Hill, he spent about 2 hours with President Obama in the Oval Office. He got a very direct message on a number of issues, and we have seen some fairly significant changes from that visit. So I want to thank you for the meeting you had with him. I think you made an influence. On some of the issues which I know we'll discuss with Camp Liberty, we've seen some changes, and particularly in the need for a holistic strategy to defeat ISIL and enlisting the Sunnis into the fight at the local level. We have seen some fairly dramatic and significant changes from that visit.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to Eliana Ross-Leitonen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome once again, sir. The Iraqi Jewish Archives, you have been engaged in discussions with the Iraqis on this issue, and your staff has spoken with representatives of the Iraqi Jewish diaspora and the Jewish community as a whole. But could you give us an update on progress of these discussions? Have there been alternative plans proposed? On the issue of the T-walls at Camp Liberty, why have there been only 235 out of 17,500 T-walls put up, and why have we only seen an addition of 43 since our November subcommittee hearing? Can you please commit that you will put extra effort in saving lives there? And then thirdly, as far as al-Qaeda's resurgence, a large part of this is due to the failure in the Iraqi government and Iraqi leadership since we left the country. There are national elections planned in Iraq in April. We were successful after the surge in getting the Iraqi government to participate in a more inclusive, power-sharing government that kind of mollified the Sunnis of Iraq and left al-Qaeda marginalized. Then after we left, the Iraqis took another step backward. Now it was the Sunnis who were marginalized, drawing many of them toward al-Qaeda. What steps are we taking to ensure that the Sunnis are participating in these elections and that Iraq can return to that sort of power-sharing government we saw in the post-surge Iraq? And continuing with the Shia-Sunni issue, we've seen over the last few days that the Iraqi military has been bombarding Fallujah, which was taken over by al-Qaeda late last year, presumably preparing the way for a ground assault. However, the Shiite-dominated Maliki government cannot successfully take Fallujah on its own without the help of the Sunni tribal leaders in the region. Can you describe the current relationship between the Maliki government and these tribal leaders, and do you think Maliki will be able to gain their support given Maliki's crackdown on Sunnis in Iraq for these past few years? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let me take the topics in order. On the Jewish archives, as you know, this is a very sensitive topic. I've been working directly with the Iraqis on this. I was just in Iraq and raised it with those officials who are charged with the file. We are engaged in sensitive negotiations with the Iraqis. In the coming weeks, the director of Iraq's National Library and Archives will be coming to the United States, and again, I hope to report progress on this. But we're engaged, and it's a sensitive negotiation, but I will keep you fully informed of those talks. On Camp Liberty, specifically on the issue of T-walls, I have, again, made a number of trips to Iraq, and every time I go, from Maliki on down, I raise the issue of T-walls. We got T-walls moving back into the camp earlier this month. They stopped. I raised it again last Thursday with the Iraqi National Security Advisor. I understand this morning T-walls are moving into the camp again. I visited the survivors and residents at Camp Liberty earlier this month. I told them I promised I would do everything I could. I also urged them to do everything they could, and that meant showing up at these camp management meetings where plans are made to move the T-walls into the camp. This is an issue I'm going to continue to stay on top of. On the issue of elections and Sunni participation, as I said in my testimony, we are focused to holding elections on April 30th. This will be the third full-term election for a four-year government, first one December 2005, and then 2010, and then this year. As you may know, the head of the main Sunni coalition, Osama Najafi, was in the United States 2 weeks ago. He had meetings with the President, the Vice President. He met the Secretary of State at his home. So we are very focused on making sure that the elections happen, that they produce a genuine and credible result, and that they allow a government to reform that reflects the makeup of Iraqi society with all represented. In Fallujah, as I described in my testimony, the plan is to have the tribes out in front, but with the Army in support, because ISIL is an army. They have heavy weapons, they have 50 caliber sniper rifles, they are very well trained and very well fortified. So we have to have the Sunnis, tribal, local people out in front, but they will require security support. And as General Austin was in Iraq last week for direct talks with Iraqi military commanders, we are advising the commanders as best we can, building on the lessons that we learned in these areas for tactical and strategic patience, for planning, and to make sure that civilian casualties are minimized.
Thank you so much. I know how hard you have been working, and to paraphrase Ambassador Crocker, everything about Iraq is hard all the time. So please keep making progress. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Sherman of California.
Thank you. There was bipartisan support for leaving a residual force in Iraq. That required a status of forces agreement with the Maliki government. And the status of forces agreement would have had to have included immunity for our soldiers so that they would not be subject to Iraqi courts. We ask our soldiers, Marines, airmen, etc., to take many risks. One of them we don't ask them to take is the idea that their actions would be held up to judgment in a court in Iraq or a court in Afghanistan, for that matter. We didn't get a status of forces agreement. One theory is the administration blew the negotiations. The other view is the Maliki government was in place when this administration got there. Maliki didn't have to give immunity to our troops and chose not to. We've seen that these immunity agreements are difficult for a host country to provide. Karzai isn't providing them, and there are several elements of Iranian history going back 70 or 80 years where the Shah was held up to great ridicule for providing such immunity agreements. Did we fail to get a status of forces agreement because we blew the negotiations, or given the political reality starting with Maliki, was there simply no way to get the immunity?
First, your keying on the history is really important here. The history of immunity agreements, particularly in this region, is really what colors the entire debate. Mm-hmm. The negotiation in 2007 and 2008 took almost 18 months. And while we got those 2 agreements passed, the security agreement, which allowed our forces to stay for 3 more years with immunities, and a permanent strategic framework agreement, they barely passed. They passed on the last possible day and almost by the skin of their teeth. And I was working on that issue with Ambassador Crocker for almost 18 months.
This is passing the Iraqi parliament.
Yes, the Iraqi parliament. Our legal requirements in 2011 were that another follow-on agreement would have to go through the Iraqi parliament. It was the assessment of the Iraqi political leaders and also of our leadership that it was unlikely to pass. And therefore, the decision was made that our troops would leave by the end of 2011. But we still have a permanent strategic framework agreement. That agreement has passed the Iraqi parliament. It was ratified in 2008, and it provides us a strong basis for providing security assistance to the Iraqis. It does not provide us a basis for having boots on the ground and a training presence, but we do train Iraqi special forces under our Office of Security Cooperation through the embassy, and we're also in discussions with regional partners for having a training presence.
I want to move on to another question. Has there been discussion of the U.S. Air Force or other air forces, naval air forces, bombing these al-Qaeda camps rather than us providing huge amounts of weaponry to Maliki so that he can try to do it himself? And has there been discussion of U.S. Air Forces preventing overflights by the Iranians, since the Iraqis say they can't control their own airspace?
No, there's not been discussion of a direct U.S. role in controlling Iraqi airspace or in targeting the camps. We're very focused on increasing the Iraqi capacity to be able to target camps, and they've proven effective in recent months.
I would point out that if only we were bombing al-Qaeda camps before, in the years before 9/11, we may have had a very different history. We see the residents of Camp Ashraf, 52 of them killed last September. In December, another 4 killed. The Secretary of State has appointed a special advisor on MEK resettlement. What is the status of protecting these folks while they're there and insisting that Iraq meet its legal obligations to do so, and of finding homes for outside the region for some of the residents?
Let me make a couple points. When I was here in November, I explained that there is a cell, we believe, trained by Iran, and it is dedicated to attacking the MEK at Camp Liberty. We had cells trained by Iran dedicated to attacking us when we had a military presence in Iraq. We did everything we could to root those cells out, and it was very difficult. We were never able to do so. So the only place that these people will be safe is outside of Iraq. And that's why we were focused, as you said. Jonathan Weiner has been appointed to work this issue full-time as a senior advisor for MEK resettlement to find a safe, secure relocation for the residents of Camp Liberty. But while they are at Camp Liberty, the government of Iraq has an obligation to do everything it can to keep them safe. And that means T-walls, and that means protection, and that is something we raise constantly to make sure that they are getting as much protection as possible. You also mentioned some other notable developments. And there's finally some real international attention to this urgent humanitarian crisis. First, there's a UN-created resettlement fund. We have notified Congress for $1 million to put into that resettlement fund. When I was in Iraq last week on Tuesday, the Iraqi cabinet authorized $500,000 to be allocated to that resettlement fund. The United Nations has also appointed Jane Hall-Lute, full-time basis, to focus on MEK resettlement. So we are getting some progress, and I look forward to working with you and the committee and the Congress to try to move this forward in the coming weeks.
We go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary McGurk, thank you for your service, and thank you for being here today. Just a few questions. You mentioned that on January 1st and reminded us 70 to 100 trucks entered Fallujah and Ramadi. Was that a tactical surprise on the part of the SIL, or did we have intelligence that suggested they were mustering and they were about to move, or did the Iraqis have that intelligence? And if we did, what was done with that? Secondly, you talked about how the suicide bombers, in a turn of twisted logic, has become the most precious resource. And ominously, you point out that in November of 2012, there were 3 suicide bombings, and that has gone up to 50. What is the glide scope on that? Or is that continually expanding as Do we expect it to be 100 by November of next year, or has that ebbed? If you could speak to that issue. Third, you point out that ISIS has set their sights on Baghdad and the south. You quote Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on January 21st. How seriously is that threat to Baghdad? Fourth, if you could, you point out the ISIL execution of Iraqi soldiers, that the Maliki soldiers did not take the bait, the army. But is that something that's ongoing? Are they executing police? Are they holding prisoners in center city of Fallujah, or the central part of, I should say, of Fallujah? And then when it comes to the issue of Christians, the USCIRF report, the Commission of Religious Freedom points out that the Iraqi government continues to tolerate systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations, and that is against a number of the smaller sects, many of them going back 2,000 years, including the Chaldo-Assyrians. What is happening? What kind of pressure are we trying to put on that government to get them to mitigate and hopefully completely end their repression of Christians in Iraq? And finally, you talked about the low boil type of insurgency that this represents. Are we looking at the possibility of another Syria in Iraq?
Thank you, Congressman. Let me try to address these issues. First, in terms of the entry into Fallujah and Ramadi. We started to see, as the Iraqis started to hit some of the encampments, kind of moving around to the ISIL forces and trying to relocate. Their entree en masse on New Year's Day was a surprise. Again, I think it was a tactical mistake on ISIL's part. This isn't going to turn overnight, but there has been a response. As I described in my testimony in Ramadi, the response developed fairly rapidly to actually expel them from the streets, and Fallujah is going to be far harder. But one thing that the Sunnis in Anbar province, they may not like the government, they may not even trust the army, but they really don't like these foreign jihadist fighters. So we're trying to kind of gather common cause against them. In terms of the suicide bombers, the average now is about 30 to 40 a week. I don't think this will be an exponential rise. I'm hoping that the kind of 50 might be, a cap. We saw this problem, the phenomenon in the past, and what we did in 2006 to 2008 was a very concerted, regional-wide effort. How do you get these people with a one-way ticket, then they were flying into Damascus, with military-age males with a one-way ticket to Damascus off the airplanes? And we were fairly effective, actually, at draining the flow. And one thing that drained the flow was increasing security in western Iraq. So we're going to try to recreate that strategy throughout the region. ISIL's strategy to attack the south. They are trying to attack the south. I would not be surprised if they're on the same playbook from 2006. You may remember that after the election in December of 2005, it was in late February that al-Qaeda in Iraq then attacked the Samarra Mosque, which really kind of led to the sectarian violence which you saw for the next 2 years. I think they are going to try to attack very high-profile targets in the south, particularly religiously symbolic targets. I hope, and I don't think they will be successful. I think the Iraqis have those areas pretty well protected, but it's definitely part of their strategy. In terms of Fallujah, yes, we do believe that Iraqi soldiers are being held in Fallujah. And as I said, these extremists or fighters are trying to goad the army into a direct urban confrontation. So far, despite some rhetoric you might see about storming Fallujah, that is not the strategy that is underway. But the government does have a responsibility working with the local people to secure Fallujah, and I think there will be fighting, particularly in the outskirts, and then later in the central city. But we're going to try to make sure it is as contained as possible. And on Christians, a very good question. We're very focused on the plight of Christians in Iraq, but also throughout the region. When Prime Minister Maliki was here, he acknowledged in his public remarks the importance of taking care of the Christian community. In October, he met with Patriarch Sacco, the head of the Chaldean Church. When I'm in Iraq, I try to meet with Christian leaders. I met with Archbishop Warda in Erbil a couple months ago and tried to focus on some of their land disputes they're having there. The Iraqi cabinet recently passed a resolution to talk about carving out a Christian province to allow them some autonomy and security. Again, this is something that we continue to develop. I'm going to be meeting with an Iraqi Christian leader tomorrow in my office. So we're very focused on it, but it's an extremely, extremely difficult issue. Christians are threatened by these extremists, as are Sunnis and everybody, Sunni, Shia, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. You know, as the ties between Iraq and Iran, it seems to be getting closer. They signed a they have a defense treaty that supposedly they put together. I am concerned that maybe the safety of people at Camp Liberty, the Iraqis are not making the effort that they really need to secure these people. If I'm making an arms contract with or treaty with Iran, why would I be so intent on the safety of these people? Just in December, they keep firing rockets into this camp. So how sure are you that they're making the best possible effort to bring security to this camp?
Congressman, the issue remains extremely difficult. There was a rocket attack in the camp earlier this month, and I would just remind you there was a rocket attack at Camp Cropper, which is right near Camp Liberty, which used to house our soldiers, and we took casualties there as late as the summer of 2011. And that's when we had about 70,000 troops in the country trying to stop this kind of activity. It's very difficult to deter and to root out a well-trained team with rockets. And that is why we're trying to move as much protection into the camp as possible. And that's why I went to the camp myself, to see it, to meet with the residents, and to try to assess the security and protection. But it remains a very difficult issue. I'll be honest, the MEK doesn't like the Iraqi government doesn't like the MEK, and it's a very dynamic issue, and all we got to do is stay on the MEK to do everything they can to cooperate, to move the residents to a safe and secure location, and stay in the government. Every time I meet with the leaders of the government, I mention this issue. Despite all the other issues they're dealing with, I mention it every single time. And as I said, I just received a report this morning that TWAs are moving back into the camp, and we're going to make sure that they continue to move back in the camp tomorrow, the next day, and the day after.
How concerned are you about the treaty between Iraq and Iran, this defense treaty, the arms going into Iraq?
The Iraqis have been pretty careful to draw a line in terms of security cooperation with Iran, and so far they've kept that line fairly firm. So I've seen reports like that, but I would not take it too seriously. The Iraqis have made clear they want a long-term institutional relationship with the United States. They want the United States to be the backbone of their military, and that's why they want platforms like an Apache helicopter system. When we sell a country an Apache helicopter, we're not just giving them an attack helicopter. We're buying a 30-year relationship in terms of training pilots, logistics, maintenance, and that's why we feel it's so important. The F-16 program is the same. We want Iraq to have a long-term institutional relationship, military to military, with the United States. And General Austin's visit to Iraq last week, he, of course, knows the Iraqi commanders. They bled together in the streets and the fields of Baghdad and the outskirts and all throughout Iraq, and they have very deep relationships. And I was in those meetings. And you cannot get a deeper relationship than people who fought side by side. And that is something that we're going to continue to develop. You know, Maliki's the prime minister now. He might be the prime minister after the coming elections. He might not be. What we're focused on is building an institutional relationship with the Iraqi government and the institutions, the military, the parliament, something that's going to last for many, many years.
And the sale of Russian arms to Iraq, are you concerned about that at all, $4 billion, whatever it was?
Yes, I don't want Iraqis buying Russian hardware, but I have to be honest. Given the security situation, there's a lot of strategic competitors in Baghdad showing up, knocking on the same doors we're knocking on, and saying, "Hey, we're here to sell you an attack helicopter. Just write a check." We have a system through our foreign military sales system, which is a good system. It makes sure that the stuff arrives with the long-term institutional relationship, as I discussed, but it's slow and cumbersome. Earlier this month, I was in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other countries, and there's a lot of complaints about our foreign military sales system is too slow. We hear the same thing from the Iraqis. But I want Iraq to buy U.S. equipment because that buys a long-term strategic relationship. So yes, it's unfortunate that they bought the Mi-35s from the Russians, but on the other hand, they kept telling us they were going to do it if we couldn't get them the Apaches fast enough.
And there's no consideration to giving them drones, right? Selling drones to the Iraqis?
Well, we are selling them unmanned or unmanned UAVs, not armed drones, but we're selling them.
I meant armed.
Yes. No, armed drones is not under consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We now turn to Mr. Rohrabacher for his questions.
Thank you very much, and we're all impressed with your knowledge level. You're able to do this and, from your memory, and we're impressed by that. I'm impressed by that. But that doesn't mean that I agree with your assessment. Let me just say that the idea that we're talking about Camp Ashraf, it seems that fundamentally you're suggesting that our approach to trying to stop the massacre, the ongoing massacre of the people at Camp Liberty, that we basically have to go to the Maliki government and ask them, and the problem is they're not providing enough security. The Maliki government is responsible for these deaths. I don't understand. The military, the Iraqi military, invaded Camp Ashraf and murdered people. These are the people under Maliki's command did that. They recently went into the 50 that were so left at Camp Ashraf, tied their hands behind their back, and shot them in the back of the head. And it was Maliki's own military, we know, who did that. We know that the Camp Ashraf and these people were attacked numerous times by the Iraqi military. This isn't whether Maliki and his people are not protecting the MEK. This is a crime against humanity. These are unarmed refugees in which Maliki's own troops are murdering. We're not talking about rockets that we don't know where they come from. We're talking about actual. By the way, I would suggest that they probably know about those rockets as well. Maliki, let's make it very clear. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as many people in Washington are concerned, Maliki is an accomplice to the murders that are going on. And as an accomplice, we should not be treating him, begging him to have a residual force of U.S. troops in order to help his regime. I don't understand why the United States feels, or why we feel compelled to be part of all of this. Why do we feel compelled that we have to go in and be in the middle of a fight between people who are murdering each other, 30 to 40 suicide bombers a month? Thousands of people are losing their lives to this insanity, why should the United States, tell me, this is my question, why does the United States feel that we need to become part of this insanity? And does that not instead turn both of the parties against us?
Congressman, the suicide bomber phenomenon, it is complete insanity. I agree with you. When you look at Iraq and you look at the region and you define our interests, and I don't go with any leader and beg for anything, but we protect and advance U.S. interests as we define them. And in Iraq, whether you like it or not, oil, al-Qaeda, Iran, vital U.S. interests are at stake in Iraq. So we need to do what we can without putting U.S. personnel.
Why should we let them kill each other? Let them kill each other. I'm sorry. If it means that we're going to spend our treasure and more of our blood, we've already spent thousands of lives of American soldiers. We've done enough. And I'm so happy that you now can report to us that your negotiations to provide a residual American military force in Iraq was not successful, because I'm very happy that we don't have a bunch of American troops in the middle of that mess. And we are not even capable of letting Maliki know that we're holding him responsible for the murders in his own ranks, for the people, for the military that he commands to go into Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty and murder unarmed refugees. This is a no-win situation for us. Both sides seem to be evil. Both sides are all the sides. One last question. I've got 30 seconds. Who is financing? You talked about 100 trucks and all of this. This equipment costs money. Bullets even cost money. AK-47s cost money. Rockets cost money. Who's paying for all of that on the mayhem on both sides of this fight?
Congressman, I defer to my intelligence colleagues for the specific funding, but we believe it's a whole source of funding, but private funding from throughout the region, funding the global jihadist movement, which is now really based in Syria and the region.
Is that the Saudis?
Again, I would have to defer to my intelligence colleagues for that sort of information. But a lot of it is private, private funding.
Private funds. Thank you very much.
Mr. McGurk, while we're on the subject, did you want to share any details in terms of the attack on Camp Ashcroft, and in your judgment, who you believe was involved in that, since that was the question at hand?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the last time I was here, I discussed what we know. We believe it was a militia. We believe the militia was trained by Iran, and that's really the primary responsibility. And we have, since that very horrific attack, we worked to get the survivors out of Camp Ashraf, which is about 40 miles from the Iranian border, and onto Camp Liberty. Camp Liberty is not safe, but it's safer. We have the UN in the camp every day, monitoring the camp. And again, when I try to go to the camp and meet with the survivors and the residents there. So we're doing...
And you're making efforts right now to relocate the survivors?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. We're going to go now to Mr. Jerry Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. McGurk. A couple of questions. First, the authorization for the use of military force, the administration has indicated it would not oppose the repeal of that. Is the issue the timing with respect to, say, pending elections in Iraq? Might it disrupt things you're doing in Iraq if we were to do that now?
Congressman, I don't think there's much focus on that in Iraq, so I don't think it would make much of a difference in terms of from the Iraqi perspective.
That's good to know. Okay. Elections in April, still on schedule?
Our team at the embassy is talking every day to the United Nations Assistant Mission in Iraq and the Iraqi High Electoral Commission, which are planning the elections. And the information I have received most recently is that elections do remain on track. We have tens of thousands of displaced families from Anbar province. We have been assured by those planning the elections that displaced people will still be able to vote, and their vote will count as if they were in their home province. So we are still confident the election will be held on April 30th, and our consistent position and very firm position is that those elections have to be held on April 30th. There should not be a delay.
What a novel thought, allowing people to vote remotely. Thought here for the United States. But Fallujah, help us understand what happened. I mean, the United States has been involved now for 12 years, billions and billions of dollars. We've reconstituted the Iraqi military. We've trained the law enforcement forces. We spent our military's blood and treasure to gain a foothold, to gain Fallujah. And, Al-Qaeda's successor organization manages to occupy it. And if I understood your testimony correctly, we're now once again relying on tribal support to essentially dislodge the occupying forces in Fallujah. How in the world, isn't that an indictment of the investments we've made in the Iraqi military, in its inability to hold its own territory secure?
Well, the Iraqi military would have the numbers and the equipment to go into Fallujah tomorrow and clean out the streets. We believe that were they to do an assault like that, that it would actually exacerbate the problem.
I guess, excuse me one second, Mr. McGurk, and I don't mean it, but before you get there, but how did it happen in the first place? How is it that the Iraqi government was not able to secure something as symbolically important, if not really important, as Fallujah?
As I tried to explain in my testimony, it was a series of events throughout 2013, including a protest movement which kind of added to the political instability in the region. And in Fallujah in particular, it is an area, as we know, any outsiders coming into Fallujah are resisted, and that includes the Iraqi army, it included us, and it includes, we hope now, these al-Qaeda extremists. All I can say is we are where we are right now, and we're helping the Iraqis develop a plan. They're developing a plan, but one that will lead, I say tribal fighters, what really mean is that the local people, local population who know the streets, who are able to actually identify the foreign elements and push them out. But right now in Fallujah, it's a mix of al-Qaeda, former insurgent groups, and former Ba'athist networks who are in control of the streets there. It has always been a very difficult place, and so it's a very difficult territory to operate in.
The tribal support we're relying on or cooperating with, what is their attitude toward the Maliki government? I mean, because doesn't some of that support and cooperation, isn't some of that a function of how they view the central government?
Yes, there's tremendous mistrust in the area of Fallujah towards the central government. There's no question about that.
And does that impede our ability to try to dislodge the occupation forces in Fallujah?
It does. It makes it harder. As I said, some tribes are actually working with the extremists. Some are now working to oust them, and many others are on the fence. And that's why it's incumbent upon the central government, through resources and through dialogue and communication, to mobilize the population against them. When we worked with the Awakening, we did three things. We trusted them, we funded them, but also significantly, we protected them. They thought they were going to win. Sheikh Abdul Sattar, who was the head of the Awakening in the early days, we parked 2 M1 tanks in front of his villa, and he was still killed by a suicide bomber. So, this is a very tough area, and these are tough folks. But the tribal leaders need to know that they're going to be supported, and they believe they're going to win. And that's why Maliki's commitment most recently to give tribal fighters all the benefits of an Iraqi soldier and to incorporate those fighters into the security structures of the state, meaning they'll have a livelihood going forward to protect their people, is a very significant commitment. It's one that's never been made before, and we now need to make sure that we hold the government to it and follow through.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Judge Ted Poe from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about what you probably thought I would talk about today, is the MEK. The last time you were here and you testified before my subcommittee and the chairwoman, Eliana Ross-Layton subcommittee, I made the statement that there would probably be more attacks on Camp Liberty. And unfortunately, I was correct. Camp Liberty was attacked again. 4 people killed, 7 injured. 1 young man lost both of his legs. Since 2009, there have been 7 attacks on Camp Liberty or Camp Ashraf. During that time, 19 times members of the State Department have testified. Most of those, or many of those, were about Camp Liberty, in addition to other things. And all those attacks, to my knowledge as of today, not one person has been captured or charged with any of those killings. Not one. And they're still on the loose. As I alluded to in my testimony, I personally believe that the Maliki government is in cahoots with the Iranian government to let Camp Liberty, Camp Ashraf, be subject to attacks. These last attacks, my understanding, were rockets came in that were 3 meters long, 40 of them. It seems impossible to me that a rogue Iranian militia could sneak those by anybody and then fire them over a period of time and cause this chaos and murder. And I bring this up for several reasons. One, it hadn't been resolved. But this has become very personal to people who live in my district. I represent people who are Iranian Americans. They know these people that are being killed. They are family. They are friends. And they come and they visit and they tell us, it's happened again, Judge Poe, with tears in their eyes. So it's become personal. Many of those people are sitting behind you and they come up here wanting help. That's all they want, is the United States has, said that we promised to help them. We no longer recognize them as a foreign terrorist organization. They just want their loved ones safe. safe first from the constant attacks by the, well, I believe the Iraqi and the Iranians working together. But long term, they want to leave. They want to be in a safe country. Now, when you visited, and I commend you for going to visit the camp, did you see these, what look like graves, but they are really what these are used for? The people at Camp Liberty are in such fear of their lives, they no longer stay in these trailer houses here. They have dug themselves what looks like a grave to hide in when the attacks come from the rockets. And they dig these, and they put sandbags around them, and then they're ready for the next attack. They jump in these things. Some of them sleep in these things at night, even in the rain, to try to be safe, literally digging their own graves. It seems to me this is a fairly tragic situation when people live like this in fear of where they are, whether it's the Iraqis, whether it's the Iranians, or both. Did you see any of this when you were there, these, what they use as now foxholes to hide in from the rockets?
I didn't see that particular lane, but I saw some of the bunkers at the camp.
Well, I'm sure you'll see it on your next visit. But now, this is what they have resorted to for their own safety. I think that is an international human rights concern. It should be. The T-walls, you mentioned T-walls are coming. I understand they hadn't gotten any T-walls today. 17,000 of them were removed in a short period of time. Now they're wanting to put them back in slowly. It's a safety hazard. They just want these T-walls to be safe. They ought to move them in now. The other concern that I wanted to mention is the resettlement issue. They want to leave Iraq. We want them to leave. The Iraqis want them to leave. The Iranians want them to, I'm not so sure what the Iranians want. But the West constantly says, because the United States has not taken any of these people, we're not going to take them either. When the U.S. starts leading by example rather than just talking about removing these people, then maybe we'll take them as well. Why haven't these folks been sent to other countries? Why haven't we taken some of them or all of them? That's my first question. And the second question is, when you visited with the survivors of the Ashraf camp attack, did they tell you who they believed was responsible for attacking them and killing their families and their friends? Those are the two questions I have.
Let me first say, in terms of accountability, a Shia militia leader who took responsibility for the attacks openly and was on Iraqi television giving interviews, taking responsibility for attacking the camp. We thought it was ridiculous that this guy was walking the streets, inciting people to attack the camp. He was arrested by Iraqi security forces and is detained and is being investigated. So that is something that happened in the last month. I agree with you that this is an international human rights concern. That is why, as I mentioned in my response earlier, I find it encouraging that there is now United Nations focus with the Resettlement Fund, a full-time person at the United Nations to focus on this issue. And as you also correctly point out, very few countries around the world, despite the international human rights concern, have agreed to take the residents into their territory. Albania, Germany, a total of about 350, so we still have almost 2,900 people at the camp. This is an international human rights concern, and it has to be treated with the utmost urgency. As you know, we are considering options to relocate and integrate Camp Perea residents in the United States in close coordination with the White House, Department of Homeland Security, and other relevant agencies. And any eligible residents would have to be fully vetted, of course, under our standards by the Department of Homeland Security, but that is something that we are actively considering, I can assure you. But we also, and I would encourage those who care about the residents, as do we, to lobby other capitals around the world, given that this is an international human rights concern, to take residents into their territory, because so long as they're in Iraq, they will not be safe. And you're right, 4 residents of the camp lost their lives tragically this month. 900 Iraqis also lost their lives this month. Iraq is a very violent place, and particularly the residents at Camp Liberty will not be safe until they leave. And that is why we have a full-time person working on it. We encourage the UN, and they have now appointed a full-time person to work on the problem. And we have a UN resettlement fund to encourage other countries to take the residents in. And until they're out of Iraq, they won't be safe.
And now we go to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGurk, thanks for being here. Thanks for your thoughtful testimony. Last year, we wrote a letter to the Prime Minister about the overflights of Iranian aircraft. There are reports that the number of overflights from Iran has increased, that these are flights that Iran sends to arm Hezbollah to expand their influence in Syria, to defend the Assad regime, even as it continues to slaughter its own people. How do you characterize Prime Minister Maliki's relationship with Iran?
Let me say a couple words about Iran's nefarious role in Iraq. Just like al-Qaeda has exploited the grievances of the Sunni community, Iran is exploiting the fears and apprehensions of the Shia community as they are attacked by these al-Qaeda extremists. So it's a vicious cycle that Iran very much takes advantage of, and their most extreme elements of that regime and the Quds Force. Maliki, and we discuss this with him all the time, tries to balance all of these many pressures that come at Baghdad from the region and from internal debates. He is under great pressure from his constituency, particularly among the Shia, who continue to get attacked by these extremist groups. But so far, we have seen the Iraqi government resist the Iranian efforts to have a direct security role in Iraq. Iran still, we believe, controls certain militia groups in Iraq, although their activities are not nearly to the level that they were 4 or 5 years ago.
So they've resisted Iran's efforts to play a more significant role in Iraq, but they've resisted the efforts of many of us here to convince them to play a more significant role in stopping these overflights. Why don't they do it?
Again, the overflights is something that all I can say is we continue to raise the overflight issue. We believe some of this material, a lot of it is coming on civilian flights. We do have certain agreements with the Iraqis, which we look forward to testing. As soon as we have intelligence, we're able to share with them in terms of actually catching a flight in the act, but we've not been able to test that yet.
I'm sorry, say that again. You've explained that?
Well, we have agreements with Iraq. It's very hard to get a precise intelligence picture in terms of what's coming on a flight and when. It's just very difficult. But when we do, and we've worked with countries around the region in similar circumstances, when we do, we hope to be able to work with the Iraqis to be able to make sure that we're able to stop or deter that flight.
Right. Here's what I'm trying to get at. It is difficult to identify what's on the planes. I understand that. Much of the frustration that I have on this issue is frustration generally with what's happening in Syria and the ongoing assertion by so many that it's hard. So much about Syria is hard, and it's difficult, even as there are now more than 130,000 Syrians who have been slaughtered. So this is one very small area where it is difficult. Yet, do you believe that the Maliki government, that the Prime Minister discounts the suggestion that there are planes flying from Iran full of weapons that are flying over Iraq with those weapons to be delivered to Hezbollah, used to prop up Assad's regime and to kill the Syrian people?
Do I believe he believes that and knows it's actually happening?
Right.
I think we've given him enough information to provide a reasonable assurance.
Then when do we start? How do we test these? You said we need to start testing some of this. When are we going to start testing? How do we do that? How do we? This is one very discrete, and this I'm just bringing in everything else that goes into Syria at the moment, which this committee has focused on extensively and will continue to focus on extensively. But with this one very discrete area, one very discrete point, that is weapons from Iran to Hezbollah that fly over Iraq. It's one very discrete area where perhaps we can have play some greater role in making it even slightly more difficult for Hezbollah to help Assad as he murders his own people. Slightly more difficult. If our ally in Iraq plays a more constructive role. So how do we test that? How do we make that happen?
First, I would be happy to come discuss in a different setting specifically some of the issues related to this topic. But I can just put you in the picture when we have these conversations with Iraqi officials and leaders. As soon as you mention Syria, what they talk about in Syria is the threat that is coming from Syria into Iraq, and it's a very real threat, and that is like their primary threat perception coming from Syria. We explain that the reason the terrorist groups are entrenching in Syria is partially due to Assad, who, as the Secretary said, is a terror magnet. And so long as the Assad regime is able to be strengthened, this vicious cycle is going to go on. The Iraqis have signed up to the Geneva I communique. They've done some things consistent with our efforts to try to put pressure on Assad. And on the overflight issue, all I can say, I've been in Iraq twice this month and has raised this issue specifically to get inspections increased again. And the next time I'm here, I hope to report some progress.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. McGurk. Yield back.
Mr. Deutsch. We go now to Mr. George Holding of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGurk, I appreciate your level of knowledge and facility with the facts and your ability to communicate them. In numerous answers, you've detailed the support that Iran is giving to militias in Iraq and to al-Qaeda-related and successor al-Qaeda groups in Iraq who are propagating this violence and undoing, I think, a lot of the good work that we were able to do in Iraq. In addition to that, where the Maliki government may be able to disavow it and say that we're not supportive of what Iran is doing in Iraq on that level, there are other areas which are in contravention of the sanctions that we placed on Iran, such as in the energy area, the energy sector. It's come to light that in the Basra province, Iran and Iraq are negotiating the building of a pipeline to supply gas into 2 new power plants there. This all in contravention, of the sanctions. Are we putting Iraq on notice that this is in contravention of the sanctions and detrimental to what we perceive as our interests?
Very good question, and this is also an ongoing topic of conversation. They share a 3,000-kilometer border, so there is trade, there's cultural ties. It's impossible to stop everything. The Iraqis have been very conscious of trying to enforce, make sure that they are working and consistent with our sanctions. In fact, they have not paid Iran for arrears that they're owed for certain electricity payments because they believe that it might be sanctionable, even though the banks in which they would pay are not sanctionable banks. So the Iraqis have tried to even go an extra mile in terms of sanctionable, making sure that they are staying in keeping with our sanctions.
And with regard to financial institutions, I mean, there's a great deal of evidence that the nature of the relationship between Iraqi financial institutions and Iranian financial institutions goes way beyond what would be permitted under the sanctions.
I could follow up with you specifically on this because it's a very detailed topic, but Iraqi banks have cut off many transactions with Iranian banks simply due to reputational risk. Iraq has also increased its oil output, while Iran has asked them not to do that because we've taken 1 million barrels of Iranian oil off the market. So, again, this is constant. But the pipeline you mentioned is concerning. If that pipeline goes forward, that could indeed fall afoul of our sanctions.
Considering the extreme detriment to our interests from this Iranian support of militant groups in Iraq, is there any part of the nuclear deal that the administration is currently negotiating that would address these issues? To put it as a condition, Iran, you've got to stop doing this.
Congressman, the nuclear negotiation is focused solely on the nuclear proliferation issues, but that does not mean that we are not also focused.
So we're not using any leverage or any of our capital in lifting the sanctions for the nuclear enrichment part of it to try to solve some of the other problems we're having in Iraq with Iran.
Given the existential threat that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose to our interests in the region, we focused the nuclear negotiations specifically on the nuclear issue to try to get at that. As
far as Iranian support of Hezbollah, which, as you say, pointed out that you've given Maliki clear evidence of what's going on as far as the overflights go and the supply of Hezbollah with Iranian weapons. Is there any part in the nuclear negotiations that we're doing now with Iran which would address Iranian support of Hezbollah fighters in Syria?
Again, the nuclear negotiations are focused on the nuclear proliferation issue specifically, but that does not mean we don't deal with the other issues on parallel and separate tracks.
But again, we're not using any of the leverage that we have in the nuclear negotiations to try to address the situation we have with Hezbollah in Syria.
We're not discussing those through the nuclear channel, no.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McGurk, for being here and for your insightful testimony this morning. As you can imagine, events in Iraq are particularly difficult to hear about in light of the heroic sacrifice of American heroes and the billions of dollars of taxpayer money expended in this region of the world, and you acknowledge that in your written testimony, and I thank you for that. I'd ask you to first speak a little bit to the difference of events in Ramadi and Fallujah. It seems as if the turnaround in Ramadi was quick and fairly effective, and obviously that is not the case in Fallujah. Would you speak a little bit about why that is, the extent of the coordination between the tribal fighters and the Iraqi government, and resource allocations between these two cities, and any other factors which are contributing to either different outcomes or different strategies?
I think Fallujah has always just been the most hardened part of the insurgency when we were fighting it, and it's a different environment. If you look at the protest movement over 2013, the protests in Ramadi remained generally of a moderate tone, focused on the legitimate grievances of the community. The protests in Fallujah, which also took place every Friday, were far more militant, far more extremist. So it's just a different environment, just like many cities in different countries have different cultures and different attitudes.
And if I could just follow up on Congressman Deutsch's question, I think you said that most of the foreign fighters were Syrian. Is that right?
No, foreign fighters who come into Syria. So from the greater region and global jihadist-minded people who come into Syria to fight jihad and are
then coming
put
into Iraq.
Suicide bomb track.
And so would you speak a little more about what the relationship is between the Maliki government and President Maliki in particular and President Assad? And sort of do they understand that by allowing these flyovers and potentially strengthening or prolonging the Assad regime, they actually are undermining their ability to take back their own country from these same extremists? I mean, do they make that connection, or what is the relationship between the Maliki administration, the Maliki regime, and the Assad regime?
Maliki and the top leaders of the Iraqi government, there's no love lost with Bashar al-Assad. If you look at 2009, Maliki was calling for Assad to be brought to a criminal court at the time based upon some bombings which happened in August of 2009 that the Iraqi government blamed on the Syrian regime. Again, they've signed on to the Geneva Communique, which prefaces that there will be a transition without Bashar al-Assad. I'll be perfectly candid. When we explained to them that Bashar al-Assad remaining in power is a magnet for jihadis and terrorists who are coming into Iraq, that is a train of logic that many Iraqi officials don't agree with, frankly. They believe that if Assad left, that the regime would collapse and make the problem worse. So this is a constant, just seeing the same picture we do. They don't always see it. But we believe very strongly, as the Secretary has said a number of times, and the President, that Bashar al-Assad in power is a magnet for these foreign fighters coming into Syria to fight a jihad. And until he is removed from power, we're going to continue to be in this very vicious cycle, which is going to have pernicious effects on all of Syria's neighbors, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan in particular.
But I mean, what other tools do we have at our disposal to persuade the Maliki government that that is the case? Because otherwise we're going to be left in a position where they're going to continue to implicitly or explicitly support the Assad regime in the context of flyovers or other efforts?
I think I just have to be really candid. I think over the next, particularly heading up to the election, Iraqis are going to be increasingly focused inward on their internal issues and internal politics. And our hope is that after those elections, with a new government up, we will work with that government to really get at this problem.
And which leads to my final question, that is it clear to President Maliki and to the Iraqi leaders in general that the responsibility to defend their country is their responsibility, and that their expectation should not be that the United States is going to fulfill that responsibility, that they have to, after a very long commitment from this country, they have to take this responsibility of defending their country and doing the hard work of bringing stability and peace to their own country?
Absolutely. And when General Austin was in Iraq last week, and I was in those meetings with him and Iraqi leaders, they all stressed 4 or 5 points. First, they want all of our support to be under the Strategic Framework Agreement, which is a permanent foundation. That means institutional, military to military. They want training support, and we're talking about doing some training in Jordan or in the region. They want intelligence support, and they want to let us know when they feel that they need weapons or systems that we can help them supply. So that is what they want. And they also want advice and recommendations for how to actually plan effectively. They do not want us to be in the lead in this fight. It's their fight.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Rhode Island yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. McGurk, thank you for coming in. We really appreciate it. I appreciate your service to your country and dealing with these very tough issues. I'm obviously not very happy with what's happening in Iraq, and I've been very clear that I thought the withdrawal from Iraq was one of the biggest mistakes, I think, historically, that will be shown that the United States has made in modern foreign policy. So I'm going to express a lot of concern with that. It's not necessarily directed at you, but it is directed at the decision by the administration. I'm a Air Force pilot, and I served in Iraq a number of times, and I remember specifically going there in 2008 and still, watching the environment and seeing people hunkered down, in essence, as there was still a threat of terrorism, but they were starting to emerge. And then I remember going in 2009 and seeing an Iraq that had completely turned around. And actually, as somebody there thinking, hey, we're serving a purpose here. We've brought freedom to people. Kids are out playing soccer. Even though most of our operations, in some cases, were directed against Iranian assets. Iran is known to be responsible for, directly or indirectly, the death of about half of the Americans in Iraq, including EFPs. And by the way, I might want to mention that we are now negotiating with Iran in terms of giving them their ability to enrich uranium. I'll tell you another concern I had is I remember I was actually getting ready to fly a mission into Afghanistan back a few years ago when I heard the Senate Majority Leader from the other side of this building say that the war in Iraq was lost. And he still has his powerful position, but he very quickly said that the war in Iraq is lost and it's time to withdraw all the troops. And then President Bush made what I think is a very brave decision to not only not withdraw, but to actually surge more troops in, and we saw a great deal of success. I think the reason it's important to revisit these decisions is not beating a dead horse, but it's the fact that we're getting ready to face the same kind of decision in Afghanistan. Are we a country tired of war and we're going to pull out and have to deal with this shameful thing that we've seen in Fallujah, the equivalent of that in Afghanistan now, or are we going to learn lessons from the past? And I think it's very important to learn those lessons. I've got a question, a couple of quick questions. There used to be a policy in this country that anywhere al-Qaeda exists, they should know that there's no safe haven. I think President Bush talked about that there's no safe haven for terrorists anywhere in the country. We see in Iraq right now, they, in essence, appear to be somewhat safe. Hopefully the Iraqi government can push against them. We see the same type of situation in Syria, and I'm for intervention in Syria. I want to be very clear about that. Is this a change in the administration from the Bush policy of no safe haven anywhere in the world, and now we accept safe havens in Iraq because we just lost the political will to do anything, or is it still kind of the Bush policy of no safe haven for al-Qaeda?
First, Congressman, thank you for your service, and I think particularly now, everybody who's served in Iraq and has experience there, it's really time for us to have a constant ongoing dialogue because we can all bring our experience and relationships to bear at this very important moment. Again, I can just speak to Iraq. And in working with the Iraqis in terms of intelligence support and Hellfires, and as I mentioned in my testimony, we're confident that Iraq will deny al-Qaeda safe havens in western Iraq. One of the reasons we believe we saw the convoys moving into Fallujah and Ramadi is because the Iraqis started hitting their camps and safe havens in the remote regions of western Iraq. So I am confident, particularly as the Hellfire missiles, and they develop even more sophisticated ability to deploy them, and also with the Apache helicopters and with the other things we're able to do with our Iraqi partners, that al-Qaeda will not have safe havens to plan and plot in those areas. And that's one reason, though, they're moving into urban areas because it's harder to root them out of those areas.
Thank you. And I'd like to say, too, I have called for and believe that the United States should help the Iraqi government in a limited way using air power, American air power, to take out these safe havens because this Congress, this House, has passed a use of force agreement that says attack basically al-Qaeda. And so I think we have the authority and we have the responsibility to do that. Let me ask you one more brief question. Israel foiled and dismantled what the Israeli officials describe as an advanced al-Qaeda plot within their borders. There's kind of this far war grand strategy with al-Qaeda and a near war grand strategy. The near war is co-opting, for instance, Iraq, all those places. The far war would be a threat to the U.S. homeland. Do you believe that the situation we're seeing and that it's the goal of AQI to be part of a far war strategy, a.k.a. an attack on the American homeland eventually?
Again, my file is Iraq, so I'm focused on Iraq. But
obviously Iraq has huge implications for the homeland.
Again, I think al-Qaeda is a real threat. If they're able to entrench in the heart of the Arab world, it'll threaten our interests vital U.S. interests throughout the region.
All right, thank you. And again, thank you for your service to your country. I appreciate that. Chair now recognizes Mr. Vargas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I think for most Americans trying to keep score at home, it's becoming very difficult to understand the situation. I think a lot of the nations there become somewhat confused and complex. I mean, Iraq, Iran, Syria, it's all kind of running together, and the issue of the Sunni-Shia discord and what's happening there. But what is very, very clear, I think, is the terrible price that Americans have paid. As you know very well, and again, thank you for your service, I mean, the amount of sons and daughters that didn't come home alive, the number of parents, mothers and fathers that didn't come home alive, and those that did, that brought the demons home with them that will haunt them and their families for the rest of their lives. I mean, we've paid a terrible price. And so, I mean, today I heard even from some on the other side, they were saying, the hell with it, let them kill themselves, let them just fight it out. What should we be doing there? I don't hold that same feeling. I think that, the price that we paid has to mean something. I mean, the sacrifice that these people made, our brothers, our sisters in our country, and the price that they paid has to mean something at the end of the day, and we should do as much as we can. I mean, I personally am very concerned about the Christian community. The Christian community has been slaughtered. I mean, the Christians that we saw killed on Christmas. Very unified attacks against Christians, 37 murdered. The Chaldean community before the war was about 1 million Chaldean Christians. Now I think that there's less than half, maybe even a third of that. We're very thankful in San Diego that many Chaldeans have been able to come to San Diego, and great community that's forming there and continues to form. But I'd like to hear from you what we can do and what we should do and what we're not doing to help not only the Christian community, but especially the Christian community, but other communities as well. I mean, what else should we be doing?
Congressman, thank you. I've visited the Chaldean community in Michigan, and I would welcome the opportunity to come to your district also to visit the community there.
You're invited then.
And these extremist groups, as I mentioned, are threatening Christians, Muslims, everybody in the region. It is a phenomenon throughout the region that is a regional problem. And one thing we're trying to do is work with the Christian leaders in Iraq to make sure that they have the resources they need from the central government and also the Kurdish regional government, and making sure that their areas are as secure as possible. In Iraq, the Chaldeans and other Christian minority groups are located in the Nineveh Plains. There is an al-Qaeda extremist presence south of there. We are working to try to make sure that local people, Christians in that community, have the resources to protect themselves and to police their own communities, and we've made some progress in that area over the last 6 months. In the north, in Erbil, in the Kurdish region, when I was in Iraq a few months ago, and I met, as I mentioned earlier, with Archbishop Warda, the head of the community there, and linked him up with the Prime Minister of the Kurdish region to talk about schools for the community and making sure that they're getting the resources they need from the Kurdish regional government. So what we can do as a neutral player in Iraq with relationships between everybody, because we've been there for 10 years and we're seen as a neutral player, one of the very few, is try to make sure that the connections are made between the governments, provincial, regional, and national, so that the Christian and minority communities have the resources they need to protect themselves, but also for schools and for children and everything else.
Now, I do have to say, though, I've heard from many that the central government, they claim that the central government is not doing much at all to help the Christians. In fact, just the opposite, that they leave them exposed, that their churches are exposed, that the schools are exposed. I mean, could you comment on that, that they haven't been doing enough, not nearly enough, to protect the Christian community, and especially the churches?
Since a series of church bombings, if I recall correctly, in 2009 or 2010, the Iraqis have really buttressed the protection of Christian sites in Iraq. But as you mentioned, there are still attacks on these sites.
The Christmas attacks, I believe, killed 37
that's right. And
Christians.
I have found the Prime Minister, when you discuss this issue with him, fairly emotional about it, wanting to protect Christians just like everyone else in his country, and looking for ways to do that. But it's something that, again, we're going to have to keep focusing on. But I think the more communication, the better, from the Christian community, Iraqi Christian community here in the U.S., who have deep ties back into Iraq, and with us. There's a lot that, if your constituencies tell you something they're seeing and you can let us know, we can work those problems.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Chair recognizes Mr. Yoho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGurk, thank you for your testimony. I feel like you've been sitting there a long time. You might need to get up and stretch. But I appreciate your endurance. What are our military assets in Iraq, and are they purely advisory? And if so, how many? Can you divulge that? Or
we have, under our embassy, under the Chief of Mission and Ambassador Beecroft, the Office of Security Cooperation, which works very closely with the Iraqi military. The numbers ebb and flow, but it's about 100 personnel. And they do everything from advising to running the FMS programs, to making sure that that is running efficiently, and a very small contingent of a half a dozen or so of our special operators who train some of the higher-end special operators as a training component. But that's all done under the Embassy, Chief of Mission, and the Office of Security.
All right, so we have a very small footprint as far as
yes.
Americans there. What can be learned from how we left Iraq and applied to the drawdown in Afghanistan so we don't make the same mistakes or repeat what we've done there, so that we've got the benefit of the effort we put in there, that both sides benefit from this? What do you see that we need to do different? If you could rewrite a post-drawdown of troops in Iraq, especially with the announcement, which I think was wrong, of the end date announced, what would you do differently so that we don't repeat that in Afghanistan?
I think, Congressman, you'll have to forgive me. I think when I'm out of government, I might look back and work with historians on the history, or also make comparisons to Afghanistan. But right now, I'm focused on the situation at hand and trying to protect our interests as we face right now.
All right, let me switch over to a different topic. I've talked to many veterans that have fought both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've talked to members of the Iraqi government, and what they have said is that we have come to a stalemate between the Iraqi military, or the Iraqi men, and our military in a standoff. In the meantime, countries like China, Japan, South Korea are going in there building infrastructures and trading. Would it not benefit us to put more effort into that so that we do have an economic trade, and that way we can help them build an economy where they own more of trying to solve this problem? I know they're working hard on it, but if we can help build that infrastructure and work with developing trade.
Agree with you 100%. And while the focus of this hearing has been the al-Qaeda threat and the rising extremist threat, our policy, as I discussed last time, is really multifaceted. And one of them is developing economic ties and economic relationships. We do advocacy for U.S. companies. We are proud that Boeing has signed a major contract with Iraqi Airways to be the backbone of the of Iraqi Airways. We're proud that Hill International, a company, U.S. company, has contracted with the provincial government of Basra to lead the effort there to try to modernize Basra in a very long-term 5 to 10-year project. I can go through a number of companies, General Electric and others who are doing very well in Iraq. But I agree with you. We need to get the private sector involved and invested in Iraq, and there are a lot of opportunities, particularly in parts of the country that are very secure.
That's where I'd like to, help focus our foreign policy, and that's why I was asking you if you could rewrite that. With Fallujah, do you think the Iraqi government can control Fallujah and defeat the ISIL? Do you feel like they can go in there, they have the willpower or the assets to do that?
As I said in my testimony, I think without the support of the local population, it'll be extremely difficult. That's a lesson that we learned in Iraq.
All right. What about with, you were talking about the backbone, the U.S. is the backbone of the Iraqi military. Were you meaning with our military assets?
With equipment and training, the Iraqis consistently look to us to be their primary supplier and primary supporter.
Okay, and then Chairman Royce was asking about where the foreign fighters were coming from, and I know a lot of them are coming from Europe. Is there any estimate how many are coming from the U.S. that go into Syria, then go over to Iraq?
I don't have those numbers. I'd have to get with the intelligence community and get back to you with those numbers.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. We go now to Mr. Collins of Georgia. Doug Collins of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for answering a multitude of questions today. I want to turn back a little bit. It was asked earlier about the elections. And really, from serving in Iraq and back in 2008, as my colleague has as well, the understanding relationship between the Sunni and Shia is something that is, I think there's a huge mistrust, goes back generations. There's multitudes of issues there. And it looks like the current government has done very little to really relate with that or work on that relationship. Experts in Iraq have talked about al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamic State of Iraq, Sham, and increasingly building the alliances with Sunni tribal leaders, and has adjusted its message in 2013 to try and win more Sunni political support. How would that translate into the next round of Iraq elections? Can we really see a move from Shia to Sunni, and what does that mean for the region? And then I'll answer that, and then I want to talk about Iran's possible influence there as well. And I want to, like I said, just speak to the elections at this point.
Thank you. First, Congressman, thank you for your service, and it's a very important question and an insightful question. This election coming up is going to be pivotal and also extremely interesting. The first national election in December 2005, there were really three main lists people could vote for. There was a Shia bloc, a Sunni bloc, and a Kurdish bloc. The 2010 elections, there was a little bit more choice, really two Shia blocs. The Sunni parties were under one main list, also with some Shia as a kind of a cross-sectarian list, and then the Kurds. This election, everything is really fractured. So you have about 4 Shia lists, you have 3 Sunni lists, and even the Kurds are running on 4 different lists. So what's going to happen out of those results are going to be a number of different permutations in terms of forming governments and forming coalitions. So the hope is that this election will give rise to the more possibility of cross-sectarian kind of issue-based politics emerging. As difficult as that is going to be, if you look at the candidate lists and the coalitions, there is that possibility there. But as I mentioned earlier, what al-Qaeda does very effectively is targets the fault line, which has existed for 1,400 years, targeting symbolic areas and trying to increase fear in particularly the Shia population, which just rises the sectarian debate and discourse in the country. So on the positive side, you have an election that's shaping up with a number of different choices, kind of number of different lists, which will allow for cross-sectarian coalitions. On the negative side, you have extremists who are trying to incite and inflame the sectarian dimensions in the country.
And I think that's sort of what we're heading in here and looking at, especially with the Iran influence in Iraq, the Shia population. And Iran's influence, and one is what we're seeing. There's also the reports that I've read and others with dealing with the rest of the Arab world, Sunni Arab world, having to deal with this dynamic of Iran and Iraq and what's going on there. Do you see, or is there a sense that there is more push in that the Shiite with the Iran influence there, and especially with everything else we've talked about here? Not encouraging discourse, maybe is the best way to put it.
Yeah, we've seen, if I could say, 2011 and 2012, when I described my written testimony, this kind of low-boil stage of insurgency, Shia militias and the most malign Iranian influence were unable to really gain much traction because the violence was at this low boil. As the al-Qaeda attacks went up this year, we've seen an increase in Shia militia activity, which has also given an inroad to the most nefarious Iranian activity. So this is something that we continue to have to work with Iraqi, not only political leaders, but civil society leaders and everybody to try to isolate those most extreme groups.
Well, and I appreciate that, because I think in really what we look at, and it's been mentioned several times here, is we look at the world of Iraq right now and the issues of Fallujah and the Anbar region and the price that we paid in those areas that are continuing. We've got to maintain pressure on this administration in Iraq, whether it be the protection of those that are at Camp Liberty, the Ashraf, the other things. This is not something that this congressman is going to let go. We've got to continue this process, that we owe that in a large sense to what happened there. So I think really in these elections, that's the concern that I would express to Maliki is you've got to do the process of working to sustain your own country without the division. And I think that's what we're expecting. And when we see stuff like what happened at Fallujah, when we see this action, it tells me that maybe we're spending too much time doing other things and not doing the things that will keep that country on a path toward a sustainable future. So I appreciate it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Collins. We go now to Mr. Weber, Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you. Mr. McGurk, you were last here in November this something. I think it's been 78 days as we count, and with Iran fostering all of the unrest over in Iraq, there's been 312 executions. If you divide that out, it's one every 6 hours. It is 4 a day, 120 a month. Hence the 312 in 78 days. It's been 78 days since you were here. We have a regime in Iran that is built on sending terror throughout its own citizenry and, of course, exporting it into Iraq. How many more executions do you think is acceptable before we take the Iranian regime to task over their executing their own citizens?
I can address that from the Iran standpoint. Again, the human rights situation in Iran is quite despicable. We have seen President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif talk about wanting to make inroads and improve the human rights situation, but quite frankly, we have yet to see them make any inroads in that area.
So really, I mean, we need to really be focused on this, even in our negotiations with, or I should say the administration's negotiations over relaxing the sanctions, because they don't understand, we're getting played for fools, quite frankly. I know that you're here to testify about al-Qaeda in Iraq, so I have a question for you. The residents of Camp Liberty, are they as dangerous as al-Qaeda?
No, certainly not.
Okay. And we promised them that, did we not, that we would protect them and that we would take care of them back during the conflict, when they were repatriated, so to speak, to the camp?
There were agreements between our kind of military commanders at the time when we moved into Iraq at Camp Ashraf.
Right, and you're aware of how many of them have paid a terrific price with their lives to live there under the agreement that we made?
I am, sir, yes. Okay,
and you're aware that they're basically having to live in graves now? We're not getting T-walls. The protection installed that they used to have, I mean, it's just unbelievable, the paper-thin walls that they're living in and the attacks that are coming from outside. You're aware of that?
Yes, sir, and as I said, I was at the camp this month and talked to the residents about what it's like to live in a trailer when colleagues of yours are being killed by rockets in trailers. It's something that many of us can recall quite
well, good news and bad news. The good news is most of them, as I understand it now, are not living in trailers. The bad news is they've had to dig out a 3-foot wide by 6-foot grave, basically, and live in it to avoid the rocket attacks. How long should how long does that have to go on? Should we not be pressing for aid to get them out of the country? And at best, while we're working diligently on that, should we not be getting them protection? How much longer do you estimate that going on?
As I said earlier, we need to do everything we can to get them out of the country.
Well, you were here 78 days ago. Has their situation improved?
Some more of them have been able to relocate to Albania, and we have to thank the Albanians for being very gracious for taking about 210 residents into Albania, and we wish there were more countries willing to do the same.
I'm told your comments earlier, I was late from another hearing, that you made comments that the T-walls are currently being installed.
That was the information that I received this morning.
Okay.
The T-walls would begin moving in again today or tomorrow.
Would you be interested to know that we've had cell phone communication from the residents inside the camp, and that's not the case?
All I can say, Congressman, my understanding was there was a decision made this morning to begin moving T-walls back into the camp. Whether or not that's actually started or not, I don't know, but I can assure you, based upon the information I've received, that we will follow up, and if in fact T-walls are not being moved into the camp, that'll be a very serious matter, and I will follow up with you as soon as I receive the information.
How soon?
I can follow up with you in the next 48 hours to make sure that T-walls are moving back into the camp.
Okay. And is there a third-party verification? Because when the Iraqi government, I'm sorry, for me, they don't have a lot of credibility. It's almost as if the residents of Camp Liberty are the enemy and not the victims that they are. Is there a third? I mean, surely you're not saying that you're going to call them and they're going to say, of course.
No. We will talk to our colleagues at the United Nations mission in Iraq, and the deputy there, Georgie Bouston, who is at the camp regularly, and he will be able to verify with eyes on whether or not.
Well, as we watch Iraq descend, I hope you make it an extreme priority to get them out.
We will do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me just begin by thanking Mr. McGurk for not just for your time this morning, but for your work on this issue. As you know, as you can tell, this committee is extremely concerned about the resurgence of al-Qaeda, the impact that's going to have there in Iraq, the impact it's going to have on the region, and of course, even here to us in the United States. So we thank you for that. We look forward to continuing to work with you on the concerns that we have in the House. There is one other issue that I meant to raise with you, and that's just turning for a moment to discuss the inclusion of the Kurdish Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan in the Patriot Act's Tier 3 designation, terrorist designation. My understanding is that this has become a sort of catch-all designation that has inadvertently mislabeled the KDP and the PUK as terrorists, even though they have been a stabilizing force in the region and consistently loyal to the United States for decades. As al-Qaeda and associated groups expand across the Middle East and beyond, it seems like a good time to take count of our remaining friends in the region and maybe take a look at this inappropriate designation and recognize that that's harming our very important relationship with the Kurdish people. So would the administration be supportive of a legislative solution to this issue and that would exclude these Kurdish groups from the Tier 3 designation?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for asking that question and for allowing me to put our response on the record. As you said, the Kurdish people, the PUK, the KDP have been among our closest friends in the region going back decades. We think they should be removed from this list as soon as possible. We think it is an imperative. We understand that it requires a legislative fix. It is nothing that we can do by executive action alone, and therefore we are 100% supportive of an immediate legislative fix to this problem, and we look forward to working with you and the relevant committees in Congress to get that done.
Well, thank you, Mr. McGurk. We did have to get you on the record for that. The Senate is working on this with the House, and we very much appreciate once more your testimony here today. Thank you, members. We stand adjourned.